Chaos in the Middle East is sending oil prices higher and higher and higher. Some experts are saying we could see $200 a barrel oil.
The price of U.S. crude oil soared more than 10%.
The front end of crude could go much, much higher.
So does this mean we're headed for a 1970s style oil shock stagflation in 2026? I'm going to reveal the answer to that question in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how energy is the economy. That's for sure. And by the way, if you've been living under a rock, what's really sending oil prices to the moon is not necessarily supply issues, but transportation issues. Because in retaliation, Iran is threatening or actually closing the Straits of Hormuz, which means all that oil can't get out. And this is why a lot of experts are saying that we could see 100 plus, and some experts are even going as far as saying $200 a barrel. But now let's go ahead and look at an actual price chart of oil and see what's been happening lately. So this goes all the way back to October of 2025. On the left, we go from 55 a barrel up to 80. See, we're kind of churning around here. We actually get to a low right around 55 and call it December. And then it gradually trends up. And then we get this conflict in the Middle East in Iran, and it goes straight up, parabolic, to the point where we are now, right around $77, $78 a barrel. And who knows what the price will be when you guys watch this video. It could be much, much higher, depending on how this escalates in the Middle East. So then we have to ask the question, what does this actually mean for the economy? So what we have to realize is not only that energy is the economy, but it goes into almost every single product we use. As an example, well, this dry erase board pen, I guarantee you, has a lot of petroleum products in it. So if oil is trading at $120 a barrel, I guarantee you this pen is going to be a lot more expensive to purchase. And that's if the transportation costs remain the same, which they won't. Let me show you what I'm referring to. So let's say that oil, well, let's say we go back in time when oil was $60 a barrel. Let's say you're paying $3 at the pump. Now, I know what you're paying. We're just using these numbers for the sake of the example. Paying $3 at the pump. Okay, great. Well, the trucking company that's transporting the goods to Walmart, they're going to go ahead and load up on fuel. So they're charging $30 to transport those goods. And Walmart has to pay those transportation costs. They're baked into the price of the stuff they buy. So say the stuff that's in this truck, they pay $300 for. And then they go ahead and mark it up to make that profit. So they sell the goods that are in this truck for $450 to the consumer, which, by the way, is already pinched. Let's remember that the labor market is deteriorating. That's not George Gammon's opinion. That's the opinion of the actual data. It takes us right back to stagflation, when you have a deteriorating labor market, potentially unemployment going up, while at the same time you have high rates of consumer price inflation. Oh, but wait, there is more. You see, this is with gas at $3 a barrel, oil trading at, let's say, 60. What happens if it goes up to 80, 90, 100, 200? It goes completely off the charts. It goes off my whiteboard. Well, then you're not going to be paying $3 at the pump, I can assure you. So let's delete these numbers really quick and go over some numbers that we would likely see if we get, let's just say, 100 plus, 150 plus oil. So now all of a sudden you're paying, and again, these aren't exact numbers, just using these for easy math. You're paying $10 a gallon. Just think what the trucking company would charge now. They got to pay $10 a gallon to fill up their truck. So before, what were they charging? Like $30 for this transport? Now, let's say it goes up to 100. Whoops. There we go. What's Walmart going to pay? Well, they were paying $300. So now they're going to be paying, let's say, $1,000. And they're going to charge their markup at, let's say, 50%. So instead of the average Joe paying $450 for those goods, now all of a sudden he's going to be paying $1,500. And now he's really pissed, as you can imagine. So it's very easy to see how higher energy prices can rip through the economy and cause higher prices in almost everything you buy daily. But to answer the question, are we headed for an oil shock stagflationary environment like we saw in the 1970s? We have to think about the demand side of the equation. This is key. So if the prices go up for everything, what on earth happens to demand? We're going to go into that right now.
Step number 2. Now let's get into some charts that I think will paint a very clear picture as to whether or not we should expect to see an oil shock stagflation in 2026. Let's dive right in. First and foremost, I want to go over a chart of M2 money supply going all the way back to the infamous 1970s. So M2 money supply is represented by this black line. And by the way, consumer prices represented by this red line. So what I want you to notice first is that we really don't see a flattening. Well, we see it slightly here in the recession of, let's just say, 74, but it's still going up. It's still going up. And then especially once we get into the mid-1970s, going into 1980, it pretty much goes up in a straight line. I mean, there's almost no deviation whatsoever. But even in this part where it's slightly more flat, the money supply is still increasing. This is very, very important. And you see that over the decade of the 1970s, the money supply, as measured by M2, went up by a whopping 154%, roughly. And compounded, we had inflation of over 100%. Now let's move on to another 10-year period. Let's do 2005, 2015. You guys know what happened in the middle there. It was something called the GFC. So right around 2009, look at what happens to M2 money supply. It really flattens out for a couple years. It barely goes up. And for that 10-year span, we have M2 go up by 75%, inflation by a tame 25% compared to the 1970s. And if we fast forward to the cerveza sickness, we'll call it 2016 to where we are today, 2026. So we've got the cerveza sickness in the middle. We see a similar dynamic where, yes, we had massive money supply growth when the stimmies were abundant and the Fed was doing QE and everyone is drawing down their line of credit. That definitely contributed to it because people thought the world was coming to an end. So they need to load it up on as much cash to make sure that they could weather the storm. But then what has happened since, let's just say 2022, money supply growth is pretty much flat. I mean, look at this chart. In fact, we declined there quite substantially for a couple years. And this is very, very important. Now, I've selected these time frames for a reason. Now let's go back in time and look at a chart of oil during the 1970s. So here we see this huge oil shock, let's say 1973 to 1974, where look at this, August 73, trading at, call it $4, and it goes straight up to 10. Holy cow. It more than doubles in just a few months. So a lot of people say this is why we saw such massive amounts of inflation in the 1970s. I would disagree. And I'm going to connect the dots for you here in a moment. So now let's fast forward to 2005 to 2015. And look at 2007. Oil's trading right around $60. But we fast forward to 2008 and it's trading at 140. 140. So it went up just as much, if not more in percentage terms, than what we saw in the 1970s. Now, granted, in the 1970s, it went up at a faster pace. This is true. But the price of oil went up to a similar degree all the same. Now, did we see 1970s style inflation throughout the 2010s? No. Now, the CPI understated inflation, but it wasn't at the level of the 1970s. Now, remember, what was a key component here? M2 money supply growth during this time was a lot lower. Now let's fast forward to another increase in oil prices, cerveza sickness, and you can see at the lows there, I think that's a little disingenuous because of what was happening, but let's say $40 a barrel, it pretty much goes straight to 120 or so. And that, of course, is due to Russia invading Ukraine. So a similar percentage move. In fact, that's a massive move in percentage terms. But did we see the 1970s style inflation after 2022? And the answer is no. We've actually seen disinflation where the CPI has gone from, call it 9%, all the way down to where it is today, hovering around 2.4. So the overarching point here is there's been many times where we've seen these big moves in the price of oil, but it hasn't led to 1970s style stagflation. I think the key variable there is money supply growth, which over the last couple of years has been flat, if not down, when you go back to 2022. So this gives us the answer as to what would likely happen in the real economy in terms of aggregate demand if we do see $100, $150, or $200 a barrel oil.
Step number 3. So are we headed for a 1970s style oil shock stagflation? My answer is no. But I think we could be headed for a 2008 style GFC 2.0. Let me show you what I'm referring to. I've got a couple of charts here. They're not actual charts. I just drew them up here to give you a visual representation as to why I think there's a higher probability we go into an economic recession, a disinflation, or even a deflationary recession like we saw 2008, 2009 versus what we saw in the 1970s. Okay, so in the 1970s, like we just saw in step number 2, money supply growth continued to go higher and higher and higher. We'd have a little bit of flattening, but it was still going up. We had oil go way up, as we know, but then demand pretty much stayed the same. That's why you saw the inflation rates stay at a very high level. But I think the reason demand stayed the same, might have gone down slightly, maybe gone up slightly during times, was because the banking system was creating a lot of money. At the end of the day, they're the ones that print the money. It isn't necessarily the Fed. So they're creating all of this money supply growth that's going into the real economy, supporting wages. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about, income and wages. So I've got the same little, I don't know, I've got my artwork up here from step number 1. I redrew the numbers so you could actually read them, but I've added this 450 to 1500. Why did I do that? Did that remind you of the earlier price? No. Let's just assume these are the pissed off average Joe's wages. Okay. So we go through the price spike in oil that takes gas up to $10. The trucking company has to pay $100. Walmart has to pay $1,000 to get the goods. They have to charge the average Joe and Jane's $1,500. But let's assume, because we've got the money supply growth, their wages go up to $1,500. Now they're still going to be pissed off because prices are going up, but it's not going to impact aggregate demand that much because their wages are going up. But let's say their wages stay at $450. Now what happens to aggregate demand? Boom. And this is exactly what we saw in the oil price spike of 2008. And what I mean by that is the oil prices going up was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as the economy, and that crushed aggregate demand to a point where it brings on a recession, and that leads to actual lower oil prices because although supply might be low, demand goes down even further. If demand goes down further, then the oil price gradually comes down over time. Remember, the cure for high prices are high prices. So ironically, this oil price spike that we saw during the GFC did lead to a moment of consumer price inflation, but then it inevitably sowed the seeds of disinflation and outright deflation that we saw for a quarter in 2009. So the bottom line is I think we're much more likely to see this than we are to see this. You say, George, why do you say that? Oh, let's look at the obvious. Private credit in the news. We all have heard about Blue Owl. Let's think about what happens with private credit. So you've got a big bank out there, like JP Morgan. And then over on the other side, you've got the, let's call it subprime borrower. They've got the 500 credit score. They're an entity or business, startup. So JP Morgan can't lend to the subprime borrower because they don't want the toxic sludge on their balance sheet. But what they can do is they can lend to Blue Owl because Blue Owl has a 750 credit score. So Blue Owl borrows from JP Morgan at, let's say, 5%, and then they lend to subprime borrower at 12% or whatever it is, and they pocket the spread. That's why they were able to promise their investors such high rates of return, which they said were risk-free, right? Just like a U.S. Treasury. In fact, they wanted to open it up to more retail investors or say, oh, it's not fair that retail investors can't access the magic of private credit. But really, that's all that was happening. So now, of course, we see the stuff hitting the fan where the subprime borrowers, like Tricolor, First Brands, they're blowing up. That blows a hole in the balance sheet of Blue Owl. They stop redemptions. And of course, what happens next is you get the hole blown in the balance sheet of the actual original bank. These are the big guys. We're talking about the Wells Fargos, the B of A's, the JP Morgans. So in that type of environment, do you think money's going to be really loose like the 1970s? Or do you think it's going to be very tight like the GFC? I think the answer is obvious. When you're getting holes blown in the balance sheets of the entities that at the end of the day are responsible for really printing the money, it isn't the Federal Reserve. Money's going to be tight. When money gets tight, you see that exacerbate the credit event. And if in that environment you see oil going to $200 a barrel, demand is going to fall off a cliff because the average Joe, his wages aren't going to go up even though prices are, and that leads to an economic recession, if not worse. Could lead to something like we saw in 2008 and 2009. And I know a lot of you right about now are saying to yourself, okay, George, I get what you're saying. This all makes sense, but what on earth do I do about it? I've got good news for you. I've got my annual conference coming up at the end of May. This Rebel Capitals Live in Orlando. This is an event you're not going to want to miss. We'll go ahead and put a link in the description below. You can check it out. Check out the speaker lineup that we have. These are people like Robert Kiyosaki, Jeff Snyder, Brent Johnson, Kenny McElroy, just to name a few. And in these turbulent times, with all of this volatility, especially with what's happening with geopolitics and the labor market deteriorating at the same time, you are going to want to hear it from the horse's mouth. You're going to want to go to Rebel Capitalists Live. You're going to want to meet with your fellow Rebel Capitalists, but also rub elbows, ask questions to these experts so you can get a better lay of the land and position your portfolio so you're not only able to survive in 2026, but you're able to thrive. Again, we'll put a link in the description below. Get your tickets ASAP to Rebel Capitalists Live because as we get closer to the event, the prices go up. And this is an event that you cannot afford to miss.